You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, play the news from The Australian.
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Wednesday, July 10. State-sponsored Chinese hackers waged a years-long campaign against Australian networks, but it doesn't stop there. The Australian Signals Directorate also said the group targeted government systems all over the South Pacific under the direction of China's Ministry of State Security. It comes just weeks after Premier Li Qiang claimed Australia-China relations are back on track. But it's not clear if the cyber espionage came up in his conversations with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Richard Marles is sending 3D printers to Ukraine as part of a fresh military package. That new pledge will happen at the NATO summit this week, and it's expected to include 3D printing technology, which can quickly produce parts for vehicles and weapons. The Defence Minister will also meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other world leaders on the sidelines of the summit in Washington, DC. A storm is brewing in the United States Democratic Party. The Australian's Washington correspondent Adam Crichton writes that senior party members are resisting attempts by President Joe Biden to pull them into line as speculation swirls about his health and cognitive state. The tussle follows an extraordinary call for Biden to seriously consider his future by the Democrats' longest-serving senator and third in line for the presidency. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. She's the self-described ex-con caught up in an extraordinary diplomatic tit-for-tat. In today's episode, the broadcast journalist Cheng Lei, detained by China for more than 3 years, reflects on what it means to be free in an essay written as part of the Australian's 60th anniversary celebrations.
When you're locked up, you become obsessed with freedom. I thought about freedom for 1,184 days.
That's journalist Cheng Lei. She's reading an excerpt from an essay she's written about freedom for The Australian.
Because freedom is like health. Losing it is more acutely felt than having it.
Cheng Lei was born in China but came to live in Australia at the age of 10 with her family. Lei finished her education in Queensland and then worked for a time as an accountant and then a business analyst. But Lei says she always wanted to be a journalist. In the early 2000s, she moved to China where she pursued a media career. Lei thrived on television, and by 2020 she was a well-known face on the English-language Chinese state-owned broadcaster CGTN. As well as covering finance news, she even had a cooking show. But then, in August of 2020, Lei suddenly disappeared from television screens. Her friends and family completely lost contact with her. Little did they know at the time, Lei had been arrested on murky espionage charges and put in detention. It would be 6 months before she would see the sky again.
And they say that they gave me 15 minutes of fresh air, but all it meant was there's a window up the top that the guard would open for 15 minutes, but the curtains are still drawn while the windows are open. And I certainly didn't feel there was fresh air. And you never saw anything except the blue curtains and the mottled carpet and the beige padded walls.
So what was Cheng Lei's crime? According to the Chinese government, Lei had broken a news embargo by a few minutes. For this, she would be imprisoned for 3 years, away from her 2 children and her partner. Cheng Lei's arrest came right as Australia's relationship with China went seriously south. Scott Morrison was Prime Minister at the time, when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging, and suggested more than once that China had some explaining to do about the origins of the virus. Things have slowly improved since Labor won government in May of 2022, and Ms Cheng was finally freed in October last year following an intense diplomatic campaign by Foreign Minister Penny Wong and others. When she stepped off the plane, Lei was greeted at the airport by the people she'd missed the most.
It's my kids running at me and my mum, who has aged a lot in the past 3 years. And we just all screamed. And my mum, wept. And I just held on to it.
That diplomatic work is ongoing. The pressure is still on China to release detained writer Yang Hanjun, who's been detained on questionable espionage charges since 2019. He was sentenced to death for spying in February, but didn't pursue an appeal due to his declining health and a lack of faith in the Chinese justice system to give him a fair go. Back in Australia, Cheng Lei's relationship with freedom is complex. On the one hand, she writes she appreciates and values it more than ever. But on the other, she's painfully aware of how it's squandered.
If we don't speak up in defense of personal freedom, within Australia and outside its borders, one day we'll be so comfortable in our virtual cells we won't even feel it. We'll forget what freedom feels like. There will be no self as you are.
For now, she's taking it one day at a time.
Sometimes I feel like an invalid, like a newborn, and very fragile. And other times I feel like I could fly and I want to embrace everything and I enjoy everything so intensely and savour it.
Coming up, why it's not all business as usual for Cheng Lei. Subscribers to The Australian get first access to 6 decades of thought-provoking commentary and detailed analysis. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au and we'll be back after this break.
Even before August 13, 2020, the day I was locked up. Like many others who work and live in China, or even those who deal with China, I had already surrendered many freedoms. We gave up the freedom to criticize the government or its leaders. We gave up the freedom to protest. Because we all held vested interests. Our jobs, our assets, our trade.
When Cheng Lei returned to Australia in late 2023, she returned to work as a broadcast journalist. She's a colleague of ours at Sky News Australia. In her essay for The Australian, published today, she marvels at the relative freedom of the media on her home soil.
We accepted that the locals had even less freedom, that human rights lawyers were locked up and their families intimidated by the secret police, that there was heavy media censorship about what to report, what not to report, and how to report. That in Chinese art and literature, the noose of state control got tighter every year.
Last month, that contrast was thrown into sharp relief. Ms Chung, a self-described ex-con, attended a press event at Parliament House in Canberra, where Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Chinese Premier Li Qiang signed memoranda of understanding about a handful of issues, including education and trade.
There are 5 documents to be signed today. The document will be signed by Mr. Liu Sushe.
The Premier's visit was a significant step in the thawing of Australia's bilateral relations with China. But from where Cheng Lei was sitting, it was a very different story. Officials from the Chinese delegation crowded around Ms Chung in full view of the TV cameras dotted around the room. They couldn't be moved through the polite insistence of officials from the Prime Minister's office. There's that unshakable Chinese compliance. Likewise, she points to the Defending Australia Summit held in Canberra in May, where an interpreter who'd been booked to translate comments by a former Chinese spy pulled the pin at the last minute.
Now, 2 points I want to make at the top. One is an ex-con, an ex-spy, 2 diplomats on a stage talking freely without fear. That's what we're defending. Another point, we engaged an interpreter for Eric, and she resigned on the spot because she was afraid that he would say something against China that she would have to pass through her lips, and that would hurt her. And this is on Australian soil. That's how deep the fear is. That's what we're defending against.
Cheng Lei says these situations are China's priorities writ large. Domestic optics first, international criticism second. And she asks, are those who leave, whether through complex diplomatic negotiations or their own free will, ever truly free? You can read Cheng Lei's full essay on freedom right now at theaustralian.com.au.